really pleased to present our first Power Talk of the day. I'd like to welcome to the stage Fred Hutch Associate Professor Dr. Megan Shen. She's an expert in loss, in grief, and she'll be speaking today about how organizations fight against burnout and build resilience in challenging times. A very important topic, obviously. So welcome to the summit, Dr. Shen.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Very excited to be here talking to you about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is how do we find hope and resilience in the face of challenging circumstances. And so to contextualize a little bit, my work, I am at Fred Hutch Cancer Center, and we've actually recently undergone an exciting merger pooling together what was formerly Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, and part of the University of Washington, to really merge our research and our patient care. And what you might know about Fred Hutch is many of my colleagues are doing really groundbreaking science there on how to cure cancer. And we've come a long way in the treatment of cancer. Prognoses that used to be terminal in nature now have treatment options. But where I live and the research I do is in the space for the people for whom those realities are not true. Even though we've come a long way, there are still many, many people, and I'm sure people in this room have been touched by that personally, who do ultimately die from cancer. And so my research is focused on how do we support patients and their families through the challenging process of walking through terminal illness and the grief that follows. And what I've learned in over a decade's worth of research with these phenomenal people is how to find hope and resilience even when things are hard. And I think we can all agree the last couple of years have been hard. So I want to talk about that today. So I want to start here. This is a really exciting room to talk to you about with this. I've been using DALL-E. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. It's an AI-based kind of art creation program. I would have to defer to you to tell me like all the ins and outs of that. But essentially, you give DALL-E a series of phrases or guidance, and it creates these artistic images, which is really amazing. And so you'll see a couple of these throughout my slides today. And this one was made, I said, a person surrounded in chaos, experiencing grief in the style of Picasso. Which you'll find is really key to direct DALL-E how to make things. But I love this image because it sort of feels like where we are right now. Things are coming back online. We should be feeling colorful. Everything's back to normal. And yet there's sort of this underlying sadness, which you can sort of see in the face here, that I want to talk about today. And I think where we're seeing that in our workplace is we are experiencing burnout. And so I want to start first with the definition of burnout as the World Health Organization defines it, because it is an actual diagnosable thing. And so what it is it's essentially when we have stress in the workplace that has not been successfully managed. And so characteristics of this are extreme exhaustion, feeling negative or sometimes cynical towards your job, and all of this leads to reduced productivity. And you may be experiencing this in your own lives, in your own teams, in your own organizations, where people are just experiencing burnout. We're hearing quiet quitting, quiet firing, people are burnt out. And so what's going on here? And I would argue what we're experiencing right now goes kind of above and beyond what traditional burnout looks like. I don't know about you guys, but it used to be when I was burnt out, I could go on a vacation for a week, come back, and feel reinvigorated. But we're seeing this continual cycle of just extreme exhaustion. And I think it's because we're living in a heavy, heavy space. A lot has gone on. We've got COVID, we've had mass shootings, we've got wars. It's a hard time. And this was an image I created thinking about, I think I said something like person balancing work, child, coffee, while running across a bridge falling apart. Maybe that's how I feel. Sometimes I feel like I'm balancing so many things, and I'm trying to make it all work in an infrastructure that has kind of crumbled out from under me. And so for a laugh, and to let you know how directive you have to be with DALL-E, this was my first attempt at that, which actually has a truer picture ever been painted of what it looks like to work at home with your child. I have a 2.5-year-old and an almost 5-year-old, and some days this is what it looks like. But I would argue that the burnout we're experiencing right now is a lot of trauma, stress, uncertainty, loneliness, loss, and ultimately grief that has not been dealt with, that has nowhere to go. And so in short, I would say the burnout we're experiencing right now is a lot of unresolved grief. And you as leaders in the room have probably been experiencing this within your teams, within your organizations, within your own lives. And we're not really equipped with how to do this. And I love this quote from, this is from McKinsey & Company, a focus they did on grief, loss, and burnout in the workplace. And this was in December 2020, so I would argue things have gotten even harder since then. But leaders are having to navigate this really complex set of emotions in their teams. People experiencing grief, stress, loneliness in a way we haven't before. I don't know about you, but I manage a team, and people now come to me with, hey, my dad's dying, I have to go to the hospital. My grandma just passed away. There's a lot of things that are emerging, and it's not that I don't think they ever existed, but we're just kind of culminating with so much grief collectively that it's really popping up even in the workspace. And I don't know about you, maybe we have some mental health professionals in the room, but you probably weren't trained or equipped with how do you deal with this? How do you deal with this within your teams? And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. So the reason I use the grief framework is because I think we've experienced multiple losses, which is essentially what grief is, dealing with loss. We've certainly seen the loss of loved ones over the past few years. I know I have borne witness to people who have died for a variety of reasons, lost parents, lost people close to me, to cancer, to COVID, to all sorts of things. We're watching it on a collective scale, as I've mentioned before, and so there's a clear loss of life that we've all been a part of or borne witness to. We've lost freedoms and rhythms, the way we used to do things, the way we used to go about things. And we've kind of rearranged our lives over the last couple of years, and now we're trying to get back online the other direction. And so it's hard to cope with that reality that we've lost all of these freedoms. We've lost social connection in a really meaningful way. In-person direct contact is hugely important to the human experience, and just having these moments of social connection has been a real loss we've experienced. And lastly, I would say you could kind of wrap it up as this, that we've lost dreams, opportunities, and imagined futures. And in the work that I do with dying patients and their families, it all boils down to that, the loss of an imagined future. A future where you weren't sick, where you did get cured from your cancer, where you didn't lose a loved one. And so a lot of us are dealing with that in a variety of ways, and in the center of that is grief. So the numbers on this are convincing. The toll is really, really high, and as we're learning about pretty much everything, not equitable. So this was a poll done in, again, 2020, and so it might be even higher now, but from the CDC. And that is that 40% of Americans have said that they have mental health challenges directly due to the pandemic. And when you look at the age group of 18 to 24-year-olds, it goes to 75%. So if you have people on your teams who fall within these groups, just consider that massive toll that it's taken. Women are 1.5 times more likely than men, and this particular study unfortunately didn't break things down by race and ethnicity, but there's a lot of data to indicate that people from BIPOC backgrounds experience more anxiety, depression, and stress than their white counterparts, and I think we've all borne witness to the racial traumas that have happened collectively as well to speak to that. I want to share this startling statistic with you. This comes from work done by my colleague, John Cassiopo at the University of Chicago, and he's done decades worth of research to show that loneliness actually increases the odds of an early death by 20%. And just to put that in perspective, that's as high as obesity, which we acknowledge is a huge pandemic here in the US, and yet we probably never think about how loneliness is affecting us in that way. And I use it because I want to put the point that being socially connected as humans is critical to our well-being and existence. And we've dealt with a lot of loneliness over the past couple of years. This also has a really high cost to companies practically. If you aren't convinced by the mental toll it takes, there's a real financial cost to continuing to ignore the problem. So $1 trillion per year are spent on poor mental health costs globally. That's insane. This is everything from days missed at work, inefficiencies in teams, all sorts of things. When you look at how it relates to grief-related work productivity loss, that's $75 billion a year. So these are people who have lost loved ones, and it interferes with their ability to work. And these data, the second point, is taken from 2016. I've looked everywhere for updated data, and I can't find it. But I would argue that these costs are even higher now. And of course, there's all the non-dollar costs that we see. Our teams don't work as efficiently. Things don't move as quickly. People aren't as passionate about their work. There's a lot of other costs related to this as well. And so what do we do? So I really do think the dying have an extraordinary framework to teach us how to walk through grief. And so the question is, well, what do you do in the face of all of this? And the answer to that is you have to grieve and move through it. It sounds simple, but we as humans sort of tend to break things into positive and negative, good and bad, especially when it pertains to our emotions or our experiences. But that's not exactly how things work in the space of loss and grief. So understandably, we all want to orient towards positive things. I like the sun, although I guess in Seattle maybe you like people find it very cozy to have the rain, but we tend to orient towards sunny days and feeling joy, happiness. These are positive emotions and experiences. But the truth is the human experience is composed of joy and sorrow, right? And so we often, though, think of sorrow as this place where it's just darkness, grief, sadness, loss, and we tend to want to just run away from those things if we could just move through it or get out of it. But I would like to argue, with the work that I've done and over decades worth of research working with people who are dying, who are arguably facing the toughest news of their life, that grief looks a little bit different. And I like to use this picture of the cosmos because to me it really is a pictorial representation of what grief can look like. In our absolute darkest hour, and if you've ever experienced grief, you know how dark and heavy it feels in that space. There's somehow light that emerges as you push through it. And the light that you see is, things I hear is patients who find out they're dying, it's like connecting with their loved ones, enjoying that cup of coffee in a way you never did before, experiencing your feet on the grass in a way you never did. And in the space of losing someone or something, it's the community that pulls around you. People experiencing encounters with the divine. All of these brilliant things happen in the space of grief. And so I would say it stays dark, it can be hard, but there's light and resilience and hope as you push through that. And so I like to use this quote to sort of illustrate that. This is from one of my favorite poets, Rumi. And he says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And inherent in this, I think, is the idea that to be human is to experience wounding, to be wounded. Unfortunately, I don't think many of us will escape life without wounds. And so the idea is, how do you think about how to have light enter in through that space? And so I would like to argue that what we're experiencing collectively is not a liability or a thing to get through, but is actually a real opportunity to rethink how we do things. So I'd like to use this picture to illustrate hope. And there's a lot of data around hope and resilience. They're correlated, which means the more hopeful you are, the more resilient you are, and the more you work on your resilience, the more hopeful you become. But I like to think of hope as a stream in the desert. It's where in this really arid, dry landscape, and you think there's really nothing else there, suddenly something really brilliant emerges, refreshing even. And if you look at patients who have advanced illness, they find hope in this most amazing way. When hope shifts from things like a hope for a cure, a hope for things to work out, to hope for a good death, for being surrounded by loved ones, a hope for meaningful connection, right? How do we find hope and resilience in those spaces? So how does this look for your organizations, right? Because I can talk to you all morning about, okay, you got to be hopeful and all of these things. But there is a real framework and science around how we move through into resilient spaces in the face of loss. So at the bottom here, you see infrastructure. I want to acknowledge that infrastructure is key. If we provide mental health workdays, we have to think about ways of organizing our teams in ways that allows people to take those days off. If we want to think about bereavement leave policies, they need to be grounded in the reality of how grief operates and how to help our teams come back online. And so thinking about a strong infrastructure that allows us to be fully human, the good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow, is key. But within that infrastructure, there's these three main things that we know from research are really critical to finding meaning, essentially. The first on the bottom here is connection, meaningful connection. I think we've all experienced disjointed connection in our workplaces, in our lives, in our communities. And so we have to think about how to do that meaningfully. This could be one-on-ones, check-ins with team members, seeing how people are actually doing, purposeful in-person meetings and events where you kind of get to catch up on each other's lives, but ways for people to feel socially connected. On the other side is hope. Now this one feels vague, but the key to hope is vision, and vision that exists within the context of the reality that we're all dealing with. So I don't need to feel hopeful that everything will go back to how it was or nothing is going to be hard, but I do need vision for how I can think about recreating things in the way they are now. And then the top is meaning. And this one is key, and I think a secret that a lot of people don't realize is that most of the time burnout doesn't happen because there's too much work or not enough time. It often happens because there's not a meaningful connection to the work that we're doing. And so if you can find ways to infuse meaning throughout your teams and even in yourself, you will be amazed at how that reduces the feeling of burnout. Sometimes this meaning is feeling meaningful, like a meaningful contributor to a team. Sometimes this means meaningfully connecting yourself to the work, or even creating spaces where your teams or where you have the opportunity to think up your own ideas that you can bring meaning to the table. There's a lot of ways to do this, but it's key. And as we focus on these three things, I really think something new and brilliant can emerge in that space that we've never seen before. Oops. And so I want to end with this story. One of the hardest research projects I've ever worked on was working with bereaved parents who had lost a child to cancer. I remember I was a postdoc, and I would sit listening to these conversations, coding the data, and I could only do so many at a time because I would just be overwhelmed, cry, and be like, I got to go home, I can't do this. But what really struck me in coding all of those interviews is the parents' ability to have hope in the hardest spaces. They would talk about communities coming around them. They would talk about after their child passed, having founded organizations in their names. All these brilliant, beautiful things they were able to do with that pain and sorrow that wouldn't have existed. And if you've ever experienced grief in your own life, or you've been around somebody who has, you find there's this real bittersweetness to loss. It's immensely painful, and probably all of us would wish to undo the hard things in our lives. And at the same time, those are the things that catapult us into some of the most meaningful things in our lives. And so I think I would like to say, as we end here today, that I really do think, as we come out of this and as we emerge from what's been happening over the last couple of years, if we find our way to actually go through it, to mourn it, and to grieve it, as opposed to sort of viewing it as a liability to be moved on from, that there might be some real meaningful innovation work to be done here. And I know everybody in this room is existing in a space where you have the opportunity to do that and to think about it differently. And so I'm very excited to see what we all do coming out this season. I'll end there, so thank you very much.